In beloved Song of Solomon and Paradise, Toni Morrison creates vivid stories that reflect the reality of oppression and violence faced by generations of Black individuals. Beloved presents the reader with intersecting stories of former slaves and free Black people, detailing the trauma experienced while enslaved, as well as the enduring pain suffered as free individuals. Song of Solomon similarly tells multiple stories, though it primarily presents them through the understanding of Macon Dead III. The novel examines how he is impacted by and eventually overcomes inherited trauma. In Paradise, Morrison creates two separate but connected communities, each suffering from their own set of traumatic experiences. Ruby's people attempt to cope with the trauma they inherit from their enslaved ancestors, while the convent women try to escape personal traumas. Morrison shifts between past and present throughout all three stories by connecting various individuals' current actions with incidents long past, ensuring the reader understands no actual separation exists between past, present, and past. By focusing on the influence of slavery and continuing racial violence on multiple generations of Black individuals, Morrison crafts tales that are grim and distressing, demonstrating the difficulty of overcoming oppressive forces. Morrison's works are dark because they emphasize the complexity and often the impossibility of overcoming trauma, personal and inherited, in a world that continually reviolates victims. J. Brooks Bunson says that Morrison's works show how experiences that result from living in a racist society reverberate in the lives of her characters. Whether they are ex-slaves or the descendants of slaves, Morrison's characters live in a world where they are subject to inter- and intraracial violence. In other words, Morrison's works are trauma-driven, with trauma being recognized as the experience of sudden or catastrophic events that an individual is unable to respond to immediately. Instead, the response is delayed and uncontrolled. Thus, many of her characters, faced with recurring assaults, develop trauma responses because resistance and escape are impossible. Morrison's characters develop behaviors due to their trauma. They cannot stop the trauma from occurring, nor do they have a method of fighting the onset of these events. One possible consequence of this is that people become preoccupied with the event. The individual cannot comprehend the event properly, so they organize their lives around the trauma. Another possible response is that an individual becomes disconnected in some way from the event or society after the event. These responses to trauma are not solely confined to the individuals who suffer traumatic experiences. They are also visible in subsequent generations. Children and grandchildren of people who've experienced traumatic events have displayed trauma responses, despite experiencing no trauma of their own. Understanding trauma, what it is and how it can impact people, can influence how the characters in all the novels are perceived. Characters in beloved Song of Solomon and Paradise are forced to deal with the horrors of slavery and its aftermath while simultaneously functioning in societies that re-traumatize them. In beloved, the impact of traumatic experiences can be recognized through an examination of any character. For example, Baby Suggs repeatedly suffers from the destruction of the maternal bond, from the inability to protect her children, which ultimately leads her to dissociate from the world. Baby Suggs has 8 children, and the only one she is allowed to keep is Hallie. Despite many promises, she is forced to endure the nastiness of life, the reality that her children are not safe from slavery simply because they are her children. She lacks the power to stop white people from taking her children. For a time, Baby Suggs does create a life for herself regardless of the repeated separation she faces. Hallie buys Baby Suggs' freedom from Sweet Home, and she sets herself up as a cobbler and calls people to the clearing. She becomes a part of a community, loves them and is loved by them, protects them and is protected by them. Baby Suggs' freedom enables her to create a role for herself beyond that of former slave. She gives herself a voice that heals the pain by calling the word. However, this life is violated by white society. Baby Suggs' daughter, Setha, and her children escape to Baby Suggs' home and are safe for nearly a month before school teacher comes for them. Baby Suggs is once more faced with the inability to protect those for whom she cares. Additionally, her safe space, the home she has made for herself in a protected community, is violated. School teacher comes in her yard to take her family from her, and she has no ability or right to stop him. This violation combines with all of Baby Suggs' earlier losses, and she is unable to continue functioning in the role she has formed for herself. She just up and quits. Baby Suggs loses her voice when school teacher enters her yard to take her family. She is no longer able to say the word because it is one other thing that has been taken away from her. The intrusion of white folks into the place that Baby Suggs feels she is safe takes away the little power she possesses. It renders her as helpless as she was each time one of her children was taken from her, and she responds by removing herself from the society that leaves her powerless. She goes to bed and stays there for years because white folks have tired her out. In the face of another assault on her safety, Baby Suggs dissociates from society. For years, she stays in her bed, focusing on colors because her role as a mother and protector has been repeatedly violated by white society. Baby Suggs endures multiple traumas, but the violation of her home and the loss of her granddaughter as a result become an event that she cannot overcome. Setha, like Baby Suggs, is traumatized in connection to her position as a mother. Unlike with Baby Suggs, however, Morrison gives explicit details regarding the traumatic experiences that Setha goes through. The novel explains that Setha is assaulted and later beaten by schoolteacher and his nephews, separated from her 3 older children, and while escaping from Sweet Home to Freedom, goes into labor with her youngest child. All these events occur in a short period, and they eventually cause the event around which Setha builds her life, her killing of her daughter. Setha suffers from multiple traumas. Each event builds on the one before it, and she cannot process any of them. Instead, she deals with the intrusive and distressing recollections and the meaning which she attributes to each event. Setha and her children are safe for 28 days before schoolteacher comes to return them to slavery. However, schoolteacher's arrival violates the safety that Setha has achieved for herself and her children. In doing so, it causes Setha to dissociate from events. She responds to schoolteacher's coming by trying to flee to a place of permanent safety. She seeks only to protect her children from the suffering they will experience in slavery. However, her flight is not a conscious act. Instead, it is a simple gathering of the life she has made in response to the sound of wings and the feeling of little hummingbirds sticking their needle beaks into her. Setha loves her children so much that she decides to put her babies where they'd be safe, but she's not entirely aware of her choice. She is physically present in the moment, but mentally she is conscious enough only to recognize schoolteacher and think, if she thought anything, no, 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 no. Later, immediately after she has successfully killed her oldest daughter and protected all of her children from schoolteacher, Setha is only aware enough of the situation to follow directions to care for Denver. Setha has placed all the value of her life in her children, and she would rather they be dead than allow them to suffer in slavery. Thus, her instincts overpower her conscious mind to protect her children. Like baby Suggs, Setha does create a life for herself after the traumas she suffers, but unlike baby Suggs, Setha structures that life around her traumas rather than in defiance of them. She chooses to live a constricted, diminished life by making her home at 124 Bluestone Road, even though it is spiteful and full of baby's venom. Setha lives with a ghost as a constant reminder of her actions, refusing to leave because the cost of running was too much. Setha's loss of her daughter and the events that lead Setha to kill her have so completely disrupted Setha's understanding of her role as a mother that she cannot leave 124 Bluestone Road. She isolates herself from the community surrounding her home and subjects herself to a ghost child's venom because she cannot overcome the trauma. She is possessed and trapped by her trauma, and her inability to fully recover is demonstrated when she attacks Mr. Bodwin. Setha is so profoundly connected to the events of her daughter's death that she becomes unable to separate the past and present. Thus, when Mr. Bodwin comes to collect Denver, Setha sees in him the same threat she saw in schoolteacher. She believes that he is coming for her best thing, and she is again compelled to act. At the moment that Setha observes Mr. Bodwin, her mind circles back to schoolteacher's intrusion and the infanticide she committed. Mr. Bodwin's appearance is, to Setha, a re-violation of the safety of her family. As a result, Setha reenacts the trauma of killing her child, but she tries to kill the threat rather than the threatened. Setha responds to her trauma in multiple ways. She dissociates from events and eventually society, builds her life around traumatic moments, and reenacts events. What she is unable to do is overcome it. In Song of Solomon, as in Beloved, Morrison examines the impact of repetitive trauma. However, in Song of Solomon, Morrison explores the intergenerational transfer of trauma, or how painful events that have impacted previous generations affect future generations. The recurring trauma that the Dead family experiences is loss of their history and identity due to slavery and murder. Macon Dead is the first character to experience the separation, losing not only his family but his very name as a result of slavery and emancipation. Yet the losses impact after being reinforced by repetition. The novel most closely follows Macon Dead III, or Milkman, as he goes on a quest for a hidden truth. Milkman does not experience any significant trauma until the end of the novel. In spite of this, he is the way by which others' trauma, his father's, Macon Dead Jr., and his Aunt Pilot's, is explained. Milkman serves as a pathway because Macon Dead Jr. and Pilot, as well as others on his quest, tell him the stories of their lives, and it is through him that some healing is achieved. Through the oral stories and songs, Milkman learns of his family's history and suffering. From his father and aunt, Milkman learns that his grandfather lost his name, land, and life to white individuals. Macon Dead is a former slave whose original name, Jake, is lost because a drunk Yankee at the Freedmen's Bureau fills out his papers incorrectly. The loss of his name separates Macon Dead from his past and the place he came from. He no longer has a people, as Macon Dead. As Jake, Macon belonged to a community that knew his history and the story of his family, but as Macon, that part of his life is wiped out. This loss of identity is compounded for Macon Dead Jr. and Pilot Dead when they witness the murder of their father. In defiance of the trauma he suffers as a slave, Macon Dead, like baby Suggs, builds a life for himself. He works a farm that pays, but it is in the way of what a white family wants, so they shoot him 5 feet into the air. Macon Dead Jr. and Pilot handled this experience in opposite ways, though they both formed their lives as a response to this loss. Macon Dead Jr. separates himself from Black communities and his history because he tries to connect with white society. Macon Jr. internalizes a desire to own things because it allows him to own other people. He assumes a white-identified role, serving as almost as a master to other Black people by ordering them around and demanding compliance with what he wants. He is ruthlessly possessive, privileging the earning of money over people's lives and safety. In his desire to connect with white society, Macon Jr. learns to disdain poor Black people, including his sister. He has no sympathy for the struggling Black families that live in the rental houses he owns, and he shows them no compassion. Instead, Macon Jr. cultivates relationships with white individuals. He worries how the white men in the bank would react to Pilot because he, a property Negro, is nothing like the raggedy bootlegger and lunatic. As a result of his father's death and the loss of his home, Macon tries to identify the society that oppresses his family and values material goods over human connection. Macon Jr. tries to recreate the ideal world that he believes his father built on his farm and secure the respect and admiration that his father received from other people. He attempts to reclaim what was taken from his family by white society, but he does so by appealing to white society. In contrast, Pilot places little importance on worldly goods. Instead, she connects with people. She chooses to be helpful to everybody, even though she is cut off from people. She finds her identity in connection with other people. She has a deep concern for and about human relationships, but places little value on appropriate social behaviors, like table manners or hygiene, and she is indifferent to money. The loss of her father and home and her estrangement from her brother leave Pilot isolated from other people, but this allows her to be a healer and mediate other people's troubles. In response to the loss of her home, Pilot renounces the worldly possessions that cost her father his life. Instead, she attempts to connect with people to reclaim the history that was taken from her family. Macon Jr. and Pilot react differently to shared traumatic event and history, but they both pass their responses on to their children. Reba and Hagar, like Pilot, find their identities in other people. Reba gives everything she can to her lovers in Hagar, while Hagar invests everything she is in Milkman. Conversely, Milkman, like his father, feels isolated from other people. He is indifferent to his family and uninterested in the struggles of Black people. Milkman's feelings change when he travels in search of the gold that Macon Jr. and Pilot found as children. On his journey, Milkman reconnects with his family's history because he begins to listen to what he hears and to pay attention to it. Pilot and Macon have told him the stories of their childhood, but when Milkman hears them from other people he encounters, the tales start to have meaning. Milkman grows and begins to understand that his father and grandfather were a source of pride to the community when they owned their farm. Their ownership of a successful farm inspired other Black people and gave them hope for the future. In Shalimar, Milkman learns his great-grandfather's history and more about his grandfather and grandmother. Milkman finds his people, and in doing so is able to reconnect his father and aunt with their past. The connections that Milkman establishes provide his father and aunt the chance to heal from their trauma. Bacon Jr. remembers the community surrounding his father's farm and considers taking the time to visit. He is willing to leave his obsession with property to reconnect with the type of community that he, in his attempts to connect with white society, has learned to disdain. Through Milkman, Macon Jr. has the chance to reconnect himself with Black society. Pilot is given the opportunity to literally bury the past that she has carried since she was a teenager. Milkman takes her to Shalimar so that Pilot can connect with her family's history. Milkman experiences dissociation due to his family's trauma. He does not understand or care about his family, nor does he feel properly connected to the world. His father values only material wealth, and his aunt disdains it. They are all impacted by the loss of history that slavery and murder have caused, but they begin to heal and overcome their loss by reconnecting with their family history. Like Beloved and Song of Solomon, Paradise is an examination of the impact of trauma on how people shape their lives. Unlike the other two novels, however, Paradise also explores what occurs when the oppressed becomes the oppressor. The residents of Ruby and the convent have created isolated communities for themselves because of painful experiences with society. The two groups interact with each other, but they are not part of one another. Residents of Ruby will venture into the convent to buy things or if they need help, and the convent women travel to Ruby occasionally, but neither group belongs to the other. The convent women are outsiders in Ruby, and those who live in Ruby belong to the town, not the convent. The separation between the two communities influences the way they handle their pasts. The citizens of Ruby hold on to their trauma and shape their lives around it, while the convent women work to heal from their painful experiences. The families of Ruby created their town in response to inherited trauma. Their ancestors were former slaves, men and women with only their skill to provide for them, who established a prosperous settlement haven despite their limitations. Deacon and Steward listened for years to how the Haven's founders built the town together because they were shut out of other communities. They know that their families were thrown out and cast away from other Black towns because they had no money and because they were a blue-Black people. In response, Haven was created. Haven offered the families a place to thrive. Deacon and Steward and the other men of Ruby take immense pride in knowing that their families were part of a group that valued cooperation and did not tolerate anybody but themselves. This knowledge is entrenched in their powerful memories, and it is what they build Ruby on when Haven fails. Ruby's citizens feel confident they can create a life for themselves because they know their families have done so before. However, the past also makes the residents of Ruby fearful, particularly the founding men. Ruby's older men fear that they will lose the safe place they have created for themselves if they allow change. The stories that help to develop Ruby tell the founding families that the world outside of their isolated community views their children as sport and their women as quarry. Outside of Ruby, their very lives are easily annulled, so they must protect Ruby by whatever means they can. In response to this fear, which only develops as a result of the suffering previous generations have experienced, the men become controlling and unwilling to accept anything that could threaten the community they have built. They judge everything by comparing it to the past, to the life created by their fathers and grandfathers. They turn the oven, once a symbol of connection between the families, into a shrine, while leaving behind the cooperation and ideals that initially made Haven a success. Additionally, their fears prevent them from listening to the younger generation accepting a small change to the oven. They interpret the desire for such a change as a threat to Ruby's existence. They fear the outside world, developed as a result of slavery and the pain of rejection and inherited from those who lived these events, causes them to take on the role of oppressor. They expect everyone in Ruby, their wives and children, to submit to them and to behave in ways that they consider appropriate. They enact their own form of disallowing by refusing to allow anyone they believe does not conform to interact with their community. They, the descendants of the rejected, choose to reject anything that is different. Thus, they take action to destroy what they consider the true threat to their community, the convent women. The women who inhabit the convent found their way there because they needed healing. Each woman has suffered a traumatic experience, the loss of children, rape, abandonment, or abuse, and the convent serves as a safe place, like Ruby and Haven are meant to do. Unlike Ruby, though, the convent has no founding fathers to exert control over the residents. Instead, the women are offered freedom and individuality is encouraged. The community that forms between the women grants each the opportunity to release the pain and suffering that they have experienced. The convent is a refuge to which they retreat from the world outside. They begin to heal from their traumas. Consolata shows the other women how to create templates of themselves, and they use these spaces as a safe location to tell the stories that cause them pain and as a place to draw the memories with which they struggle. Their loud dreaming allows the women to heal from their past. They cease to be haunted while the residents of Ruby continue to suffer. In spite of the healing they achieve, the women of the convent are re-victimized by others, specifically the men of Ruby. Steward, Deacon, and the other founding fathers believe that because the convent women do not submit to what they view as acceptable behaviors, they are what endangers Ruby. Rather than accepting their responsibility for the discontent that exists in Ruby, the men blame the convent women for all the problems that have developed. The men have become so entangled in the myths that they have created regarding what made Haven perfect and thus what will make Ruby perfect that they become what they want to guard themselves against, the oppressors. They fear the world outside of Ruby and the rejection their forefathers faced there is so extreme that they convince themselves that visiting that rejection on those they consider as different is the only option to protect their community. They reenact, as Setha does when faced with what she believes is to be a threat to her child, the traumatic experiences of their ancestors disallowing, by attacking the convent to eliminate the danger they perceive. The men shape their worldview and determine their actions as a response to the suffering faced by their ancestors. They build their community around the refusal of other communities to accept them, and eventually they become the same as those communities. In contrast, the women of the convent use their community as a space to heal, just as Setha and baby Suggs try to do before schoolteacher appears, and as Milkman does successfully when he reconnects with his family's roots. In beloved Song of Solomon and Paradise, Morrison presents readers with painful stories of families and communities impacted by slavery and violence. She creates dark and complex tales that echo the suffering that Black people bear in reality. The novels examine how individuals are affected by horrific events and whether they can overcome those trials. The characters in each story are forced to confront or forget past events to build lives outside of their experiences. Some suffer from the inability to connect with their communities. Some are unable to create lives that do not act as a direct reflection of the trauma they have endured. Others, however, are able to create or find some measure of healing for themselves, usually as a result of forming connections within community. By acknowledging that characters form trauma responses as a means of survival, and by making connections between the fictional characters and their communities that Morrison develops and the real people and their communities, readers can offer more understanding and compassion to those impacted by the horrors of slavery and other painful experiences.